Tal. It's nice to see you. I know we've been off for a little bit, so it's nice to return, have a chance to study together. And so today's class is really motivated by this week, which is a week where we're commemorating both Yom HaZikaron, Israel Memorial Day, as well as Yom Ha'atzmaut, celebrating Israel's independence. And today's class is not going to be very political, although it certainly has many political implications. But we're really going to be talking about some of the ways in which Israel has been understood in classical Jewish texts, in the Torah, a bit in some of the rabbinic texts in the Talmud, and by some of the medieval scholars. And then we're going to take a look also at how some of the mostly sort of proto-Zionist or early Zionist thinkers thought about these texts, and also how anti-Zionist thinkers thought about these texts. And the intention here is really to give us a bit of a broad overview of some of those core ways that Israel has been thought of in our tradition. Again, less going into contemporary politics. We're not going to touch on that very much. And I do so with a couple of intentions, one of which is that I think most of us are consumed by the contemporary and the political for very obvious reasons. And this just gives us a bit of a breather from that, but also an opportunity to still think about Israel and have that still be on our minds and in our hearts. And also, I hope that there's some level of diversity amongst the group who's joining us here in terms of your political views. And while it's important for us to have strong ideological positions and politically, hopefully there's also opportunities that we can cross some of those divides, and studying Torah together is one way that I think we can accomplish that. So for those of you who are new to our classes, you should have received an email from me just a little while ago that has both a link to our website where you can find the sources, and also I attached the sources, and then I'm going to share my screen now. So we're going to learn these texts together, and you can sort of follow along on my screen if you want. And then the last thing is, just because there are too many people to have this really be interactive, this is mostly frontal. At the end, we'll have some opportunity for conversation, but you should feel free to use the chat, and I won't be monitoring that. Hopefully be kind and polite, but you can have conversations amongst yourselves there. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And just let me know if you can see, let me know if you can't see, I guess. And the way that we tend to do this, you'll have almost all the sources. If they are not in English, you'll have the originals, but we're going to just go through this in English to make it accessible, but I want to make sure that you have the originals in front of you. Okay, so I want to begin by just a quick overview of looking at sort of where the land of Israel emerges in the first primary texts in the Torah. And we see that, a source that probably many of us are familiar with, where God tells Abraham to leave his home. And we read, the Lord said to Avram, who is yet to be Abraham, "Get thee out of your country, from your kindred, from my father's house, unto the land that I will show you. And I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and be thou a blessing. And the Lord appeared unto Avram and said, Unto thy seed will I give this land. And he built there an altar to the Lord who appeared from him, etc." Now, there are a couple of key pieces here. So one, there is a covenant which is being established or about to be established, and God is giving Abraham this land. And so there are certainly important elements there in terms of that this land becomes owned by Avram. But another piece to this that we can also see is that the land goes hand in hand with Avram becoming a great nation. And great nation here has to do with it's quantitative, that he will have many descendants. And so the land becomes a place to hold the people. And that becomes, so it's not just a land of some kind of general gift, but also as a place to house this nation. And then, as we'll see, the rest of the Torah then sort of lays out what that nation is meant to do. So the land then is in service in many ways, it seems, of whatever the broader telos is of the nation. Now, a relatively contemporary philosopher, I think he passed away a few years ago, Michael Wyschogrod, talks about here, and we may have seen this text once before in another class, the significance of Avram being chosen here, not just as an individual, but as a family, not just based on ideological beliefs, but also that his lineage gets chosen as their lineage. And he writes that Judaism is not a set of beliefs, however broadly that term be interpreted. A full definition of Judaism does, of course, involve a whole complex of ideas, beliefs, values, and obligations posed by Judaism. But however crucial these are, they are, in a sense, a superstructure rather than foundation. The foundation of Judaism is the family identity of the Jewish people as the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Whatever else is added to this must be seen as growing out of and related to the basic identity of the Jewish people as the seed of Abraham elected by God through descent from Abraham. This is the crux of the mystery of Israel's election. By electing the seed of Abraham, God creates a people that is in his service in the totality of its human being and not just in its moral and spiritual existence. So I'll unpack this in a moment, but what I mentioned before, that Abraham is given this land to kind of become something in it, there's also a way here where Michael Wischergrad talks about is really a much more holistic understanding of what Judaism is. It's not just a set of beliefs or values, but it's actually the sense of being chosen as a family, as a lineage, as a people that then has a home in a very large sense, meaning a land, which is different than how we may typically think of religion, which would be founded primarily on a sense of a shared faith or shared values. And that might be because we have a Christian sense of what religion is, but Judaism is something different. And so as we see here, having this land is part of this more holistic sense of election, of the choosing of Abraham, because he's not just chosen based on a shared sense of ideas, but actually of as a family. And then there, as a result, you kind of need a physical place for those people to live together. We're going to return to this general idea a bit when we get to Rav Kook towards the end. Now, there are other ways that we might want to think about what Israel means. For instance, we don't have to read this inside, but in the Exodus story, right, Israel becomes a place of refuge for the Israelites, for the Jewish people. They're returning to the land that was promised to Abraham, and Abraham was also promised that his descendants, or he's told, would descend into Egypt and eventually return. But a sense of Israel is also a place of refuge for the Israelites emerging from their place of persecution and enslavement. Now, lest we think that the land of Israel is morally neutral, again, I said before, where we saw in Wischergrad, that there's a sense that it's a home for the people, not just based on shared beliefs. Nevertheless, there are still certain expectations, certain religious expectations, certain moral expectations. And we really see that in what academics call the holiness code in Leviticus, which is all about how the Israelites are meant to be holy. And here we read the following, a very striking and powerful statement. Do not defile yourselves in any of those ways, the ways that the non-Israelite inhabitants had, for it is of the land, for it is by such that the nations that I am casting out before you defiled themselves. Thus the land became defiled, and I called it to account for its iniquity, and the land spewed out its inhabitants. But you must keep my laws and my rules, and you must not do any of those abhorrent things, neither the citizen nor the stranger who resides among you. For all those abhorrent things were done by the people who were in the land before you, and the land became defiled. So let not the land spew you out for defiling it, as it spewed out the nation that came before you. So we see here that this promise, this land of Israel, is conditional. In as much as Abraham was promised it, in some level that the relationship gets established, and that continues to exist in perpetuity, the Israelite and then the Jewish presence on the land is seen as conditional for appropriate and proper behavior. And I think particularly striking is also two things. One, that the land can almost get defiled. There's almost a personification of the land, that it absorbs our behavior, the Israelites' behavior, their sins, and in some ways, therefore, can be a kind of metric of how the people are doing. If they are behaving themselves and acting properly, morally, with holiness, then they can continue to live on the land. If not, the land will kick them out. They won't physically be able to reside there. The other piece here, which I think is important, is in so much as Abraham is promised this land, there is still very much a parallel which is being drawn to the Israelites as they're now residing on the land and the people who came before them. God's saying that just as I cast them out based on their behavior, and you're no different. You may have at this point a special relationship with the land, but you also, that is conditional just like it was for them. And don't delude yourselves into thinking that this will be automatic. So that I think covers a couple of places in which the Torah discusses conceptually what the land of Israel means. A couple of other points to keep in mind are also that there are laws in the Torah that are only applicable in the land of Israel. For instance, the laws of Shemitah, the laws of the sabbatical year where the land has to rest. There are other tithing laws that are only applicable on a biblical level in the land of Israel itself. So we have also there becomes this kind of special relationship between the people in Israel, such that mitzvot, which are not just sort of laws that are imposed in a restrictive manner upon us, but mitzvot are also meant to be a way that we can be in relationship with God. There are ways that we can be in relationship that are only possible in the land of Israel and don't apply elsewhere. And as a result, we begin to see in rabbinic texts that there is a significance and importance to the land of Israel. And one such text is in the Mishnah and Ketubot, where we read that one may force their family to go to the land of Israel, but one may not remove them. One may force their family to go to Jerusalem, but one may not remove them. And this applies both to men and to women. And so we see that there begins to be a real kind of hierarchy in terms of how we are understanding various plots of land, both Israel and outside of Israel, and even within Israel, Jerusalem. So much so that that one can actually kind of coerce their family members to join with them. And there are other texts that go into more detail about whether it's ever permissible for someone to leave the land of Israel, and if so, under what specific circumstances, mostly for things that are other significant values within Judaism, but kind of the default is that you should be living in the land of Israel, and it has this added level of significance. Now, Nachmanides, one of the sort of counterparts to Maimonides, Rambam, Nachmanides, who's also a medieval scholar, has what's probably the most radical understanding of the relationship between the land of Israel and the rest of the enterprise of keeping Torah and mitzvot. And he writes the following, the second paragraph is really the crux. He says, though I do exile you from Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, continue to be distinguished by the observance of mitzvot, so that when you return, they will not be new to you. This may be compared to the parable of a king who became angry with his wife, so that when she went back to her father's house, said he to her, adorn yourself with your ornaments, so that when, sorry for the typos here, so that when you return home, they will not be new to you. Similarly, the Holy One, blessed be he, said to Israel, my sons, be distinguished by mitzvot, so that when you come back, they should not be new to you. And then he continues in the next paragraph. The rabbis explain that we must observe them, meaning the mitzvot, so that they shall not be novelties to us when we return to the land. For the main fulfillment of the commandments is to keep them when dwelling in the land of God. And essentially what Nachmanides is saying here is that all of these laws of the Torah, which for many of us, regardless of how we approach them or how observant we are of these mitzvot, we're coming out of many years in exile in the diaspora, where the observance of mitzvot was a core way that we think about what Judaism is. And certainly when we read traditional classical texts, that's how it's understood. And yet, what Nachmanides here is saying is that all of our observance, for those of us who are outside of Israel, is really just practice, right? That we are fundamentally meant to be observing the Torah in the land of Israel. And outside the land of Israel, there's really no or almost no inherent value to that practice. This is a fairly shocking claim. That's why I said it's radical, except insofar as the practice of those mitzvot or the observance of them maintains them so that when we eventually go back to Israel, they won't be new, meaning we will be accustomed to them and we wouldn't have forgotten them. but a fairly dramatic and radical understanding here from Nachmanides. Okay, another text that we can look at from the Talmud, which is also fairly striking and might seem exaggerated, but a powerful statement. Where we read in the Talmud in Ketubot, our masters taught a person should ever strive to live in the land of Israel, even in a city whose inhabitants are mostly idolaters, which itself is fascinating, right? It's saying better to live in the land of Israel in a community that doesn't even support your fundamental tenets than to live outside, and one should avoid living outside the land, even in a city whose inhabitants are mostly Jews. For he who lives in the land of Israel is like one who has a God, and he who lives outside the land is like one who has no God. Therefore, it is said to give you the land of Canaan to be your God, and the rabbis are understanding the connection here where it's saying giving you the land and to be your God. It's as if living in the land is like having a God. Now, the Talmud challenges this, but is it conceivable that he who lives outside the land has no God? No, of course not. What this means is that he who lives outside the land is regarded as if he worshipped idols. I mean, those things are on comparable level of value. Similarly, David said, "For they have driven me out this day, so I should not cleave to the inheritance of the Lord, saying, go serve other gods." Now, who would have said that to David, serve other gods? Rather, this is to tell you that whoever lives outside the land may be regarded as one who worships idols. So this is a striking statement and seems to suggest that, and by the way, this is written in the Talmud, right? So this is after the second exile. This would seem to suggest that basically anyone in any stage of Jewish history who has the ability, the means to move to Israel should do so, right? Even if your Jewish connection there, your religious community there would be weaker than in exile, seems to be saying here that's still in the hierarchy of choices, that's the one that should be given preference. So that's just one side of the coin. We begin to see a bit of a hedging on this. And one example comes from Tosfot, who's also part of the French and German. They're the descendants or sons-in-law of Rashi, major classical commentaries on the Talmud, a collection of scholars. And we read there, commenting on what we just saw, that this, meaning what we just saw in the Talmud, that you have to always make your way to Israel, isn't operable nowadays because the paths are dangerous. So one reason why you might be exempt from having to move to Israel would be that it's dangerous to do so. Additionally, Rabbeinu Chaim, one of the Tosafists, would say that currently there is no mitzvah to live in Israel because there are a number of mitzvot that can be performed only in Israel, and they are subject to various punishments, and we aren't capable of being vigilant regarding them. Now, this becomes a separate, fascinating idea, which actually does motivate quite a few centuries of Jewish attitudes towards living in Israel, which is that on the one hand, Israel is seen as having this kind of elevated status religiously, which would make you think, great, that means you should be there. The Jewish people are meant to be there, meant to observe the Torah there. At the same time, we see that the stakes of living there are actually much higher, as we saw that if you don't behave properly, the land will kick you out. And so what Tosfot here is saying is, what that means is, if the stakes of living there are higher, you shouldn't move there if you're not prepared to live up to those expectations. And saying that nowadays, in his time, whatever this would be, say 13th century, a sense that most people are not actually fit to live in Israel, and therefore they shouldn't go there. And I think this general thinking was part of what motivated that for a long time, the only people who would live in Israel, let's say like the old Yishuv, tended to be people who were understood to be extremely pious and extremely religious. They're a very small community that was there. And I think part of that was motivated by this general idea that only the people who really could devote themselves properly to religious behavior should actually live there. But the Talmud here in Ketubot goes a bit further. And we read the following. Rabbi Zera was evading Rabbi Yehuda, because he wanted to go up to the land of Israel. Rabbi Yehuda had expressed the following view: whoever goes up from Babylon to the land of Israel transgresses a positive commandment For it says in Jeremiah, they shall be carried to Babylon, and there shall they be until the day that I remember them, says the Lord. And this is now going to take us to what I'd say is really the second half of our understanding of Israel, which is, in addition to everything that we have now just seen, this tension between it's an elevated land, we should live there, that's the only place where mitzvot can be fully actualized, the sense from Tosfot here that maybe we don't have to if it's dangerous, or maybe we're not qualified to go. But there does seem to be, already going back to the time of the Talmud, a particular voice which basically seems to be saying that the exile, the diaspora, which is discussed and envisioned in the prophets, is a punishment, which means that there's kind of a divine decree that Jewish people should not be in Israel. So regardless of what we think of Israel as kind of the ideal situation, that Jews would be living there to fulfill Avram's promise and be living piously, there's a sense here that we have collectively been punished, going back now almost 2,000 years. And as a result, we should not be violating that divine punishment. And this general idea is what then becomes a major point of contention as we get to modern political Zionism and how religious thinkers thought of that. But before we do that, there's one other important piece that also comes from this section of the Talmud here in Ketubot, which is a midrash off of a verse in the Song of Songs in Shir Hashirim. And there we read that there were 3 oaths that were that took place at the time of the exile. One is that the Jewish people should not ascend the wall, and we'll see what Rashi says about that in a minute. One is that God made the Jewish people swear not to rebel against the nations of the world to settle the land. And the other is that God made the nations swear not to persecute the Jews more than necessary. And what Rashi understands to ascend the wall means together by force. So we have what I think is a somewhat strange piece here in the Talmud, which is this sort of midrashic understanding that as the Jewish people were exiled, there was kind of these 3 oaths that were made, and who exactly is making these oaths? Is this happening in kind of just some mystical realm? It's unclear, but that there's kind of a cosmological agreement that's been made that the Jews will accept their exile, that they won't return to the land and they won't try and do so by force, and that means that the cities where they've taken refuge in exile, that their non-Jewish hosts won't treat them too harshly. Now, the final line there is one which is interesting, because it says they won't persecute the Jewish people more than necessary. So there does seem to be an implication there that exile is meant to be harsh. But when what exactly is necessary, what's not necessary, it's a little bit difficult to look back at Jewish history even before the Holocaust and sort of look at anything that was happening as sort of being necessary. And again, I want to emphasize that this text is an unusual one, and as a result, it's somewhat strange, as we're going to see in a moment. It actually motivates some major, really theological or philosophical and political, ultimately, perspectives on Zionism, and even actually before we get to Zionism, some general notions of how we should approach living in the land of Israel. And the first that I want to share comes from Maimonides. He wrote a series of letters to the Jewish community in Yemen. And this one, number 20, he says the following: they have a desire to go up and settle the land of Israel. And he writes to them, Solomon of blessed memory, who's understood to have written the Song of Solomon, Shir Hashirim, and that's the basis for this 3 oaths, the interpretation of the 3 oaths, inspired by the Holy Spirit, foresaw that the prolonged duration of the exile would incite some of our people to seek to terminate it before the appointed time. Now, what exactly is the appointed time? I don't fully know. And as a consequence, they would perish or meet with disaster. Therefore, he admonished and adjured them in metaphorical language to desist. As we read, I adjure you, O daughters of Jerusalem, by the gazelles and by the hinds of the field, that you awaken not, nor store up love until it please. This is the source of the 3 oaths. Now, brethren and friends, abide by the oath, and stir not up love until it please. So Maimonides is already using this text from Ketubot to basically say, don't go to the land of Israel because these three oaths are continued to be applicable. And he's even saying Solomon foresaw that people would, we're already talking about 1,000 years after the exile, that it would feel like this is a long time. We want to return, saying you shouldn't, you should wait until it happens sort of by the divine hand at the appointed time. Now, again, this is very difficult because how are we supposed to know what would be the signs that we're returning to Israel in a more when the time has arrived? Unclear, and we'll see that in a minute or two some of the consequence of that. But the most important point is that we're seeing here already that it's being applied, these three oaths, in a practical way by a scholar as great as Rambam, as Maimonides. Now, Nachmanides, who I mentioned before, often disagreed with Rambam. So Ramban, then there's Rambam and Ramban, Maimonides, Nachmanides. And Nachmanides disagrees here, and he says the land shouldn't be left in the hands of Gentiles in any generation. Remember, he's the one who said that living outside the land of Israel is just practice. And he's saying here, though, that we shouldn't leave it in the hands of Gentiles ever. Settling the land of Israel is a positive commandment that is operable for all generations and even during the time of exile. So you can imagine that if Nachmanides, as opposed to Maimonides, were corresponding with the Jews in Yemen, he would say, of course you should go up. If you're capable of moving to Israel, you absolutely should move there. At any time, we have a mitzvah to settle the land of Israel. Now we're going to fast forward a bit to the 19th century, where we are going to see how some of these texts were understood as we enter into kind of a moment of revival of settling the land of Israel, which ultimately also becomes sort of proto-Zionism and certainly with Herzl, modern political Zionism. And the most significant, I would say, thinker who was opposed to Zionism and still has a major lasting legacy today was Yoel Teitelbaum, who was the Satmar Rebbe. And the Satmar Hasidim took a very powerful and strong anti-Zionist approach, which still lingers till today. If you walk in some areas in Mea Shearim, I assume it's still there today. I haven't been to these neighborhoods in at least a decade, but you might see signs that would say Zionists are the Amalekites. I would say the most extreme group of this, the Neturei Karta, who are a breakoff, those we see who still come to protests that exist that are happening basically anytime there's a protest happening in the States. You'll see them chanting against Zionists, holding Palestinian flags. And this all comes from this notion of the three oaths. And Teitelbaum writes the following: because of our sinfulness, we have suffered greatly. In our generation, one need not look far for the sin responsible for our calamity. The heretics have made all kinds of efforts to violate these oaths, to go up by force, and to seize sovereignty and freedom by themselves before the appointed time. So Teitelbaum is saying two things. One, he carves out a whole major theology based on these three oaths, which again, we've seen precedent for this in Maimonides. But when I read that piece in the Talmud, without sort of seeing some later interpretations of that, I would not have been inclined to think this would be sort of the foundation of one's theology. It seems like a minor point, which is trying to convey a certain idea in a midrashic sense, but I would not have read it as being so normative. But here already we see that Rambam does, and this is what motivates also the Satmar Hasidic anti-Zionism. Now, there are other pieces to why most Orthodox rabbis were opposed to Zionism in the 19th century. We're going to see some counterexamples in a moment. But part of it has to do a lot with the fact that, right, historically, if we situate ourselves, this is coming, a century or so, a little bit less, out of the emancipation. We have the rise of reform. Orthodoxy is very much under threat. And Zionism is now not entirely, but by and large, a secular initiative. And in some ways, it becomes a kind of new Torah. And so I don't think this is what's motivating Rabbi Teitelbaum, but I think what motivates a lot of the Orthodox opposition to Zionism is a sense that this is a threat, like reform was, like emancipation was in many ways, to traditional Judaism. Now, reform also wasn't in favor of Zionism for other reasons. So I'm not saying Zionism and reform were the same, but we can see how it was a difficult sell to the Orthodox community to say you should join in this essentially secular enterprise, which is in many ways a kind of secular messiah, to replace the sort of ultimate goals of traditional Judaism, traditional Orthodox Judaism. But again, those are other Orthodox thinkers. For Rabbi Teitelbaum, these three oaths seem to be at least the overt opposition to Zionism. Now, I will say, as I mentioned before, it's a little bit hard for me to fully, on my own, accept the piece from the Talmud of the three oaths. But others also challenge that perspective, that anti-Zionist perspective, for a number of reasons. One of them, just to scoot back up here for a moment, right, is this notion that there's an agreement which is made that the Jews are not supposed to be persecuted more than necessary. And we see in kind of Jewish contract law that if two people make an oath to do a certain thing and one of them violates the oath, the other is exempt from the oath and doesn't need it to be annulled. So one could say that if there's some kind of, again, what exactly that those oaths are, it's a bit unclear, but there's some kind of agreement, which is, hey, nations of the world, the Jews are going into exile. They're not going to cause any trouble, and they're not going to try and leave and go back up to the land of Israel, so long as you treat them with some modicum of lack of persecution. Then if that's the case, well, we can look at the history of how the non-Jews treated us, and we can say that oath never applies. But anyway, I do think there are deeper issues that are underlying this, not just that one text from the Talmud feels like it's so binding, but I think the broader question that text relates to, and that we also saw, by the way, slightly before that, in Ketubot, right, that there's a positive commandment, quoting from Jeremiah, that will be carried off to Babylon. Here we could say it's not so much that these oaths are binding, but it's more that, as we saw going back right to the beginning, that there's certain high expectations for how we're supposed to behave in the land of Israel, and we didn't meet those expectations. The land kicked us out, and we should accept that exile upon ourselves until some kind of messianic era. And so the broader question at play here is less this technicality of the oaths, but actually far more about a general question, which is, are we meant now to be in exile? Is that kind of the state that God wants from us, theologically thinking, or are we free to return to Israel? And a couple of the Orthodox thinkers who I would say were very much partial to Zionism, can't quite call it that then, because Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher, you can call it proto-Zionism. He dies in, I think, 1870s. So really, he's motivated not by modern political Zionism, but I think it was already in the air, probably to some extent. But he says the following, and he was a Prussian rabbi who was in favor of settling the land of Israel and took practical measures to raise money and encourage people to move there. And he writes that if a man should come before you and sanctimoniously declare, either orally or in writing, that the Messiah will be sent from heaven at one stroke, you should pour coals upon his head, saying you are a denier of prophecy. So for Kalisher, he's arguing, saying, okay, we might look back at Jeremiah and see that the exile was a divine punishment. It's also been a really long time. And there are also promises in the prophets that say that we will ultimately return to Israel. So he's basically saying it's totally okay to go ahead and to begin to move to Israel. And there's a way in which that is also, I would say, messianically motivated, because he's saying that you would be denying prophecy. So it's not only that it's a complete 180 from how others might understand the prophetic texts that say you have to be in exile. He's not only saying those aren't active, but he's saying the prophetic texts actually tell us we must return to Israel. And so there's a messianism that exists there also. And that is also similar messianism was found in Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai, who was also a one of these proto-Zionists. And he is, as I mentioned before, Kalisher, I think, is Prussian. Alkali is a Sephardi rabbi born under Ottoman rule, I think, in Serbia. And he actually moves to Israel and lives there, maybe opens yeshiva there, I forget exactly. But he very much believed in that this was the Messianic era. And he writes, "Our holy rabbis are delaying the consolation of our land. The people expect a man to come from heaven in a fiery horse-drawn chariot and gather up the scattered remnant of Israel. But this outworn idea has become a stumbling block to the people of Israel." So he is saying, the people who are telling you, the rabbis who are saying that eventually the time will come and we're going to have a miraculous return to Israel, he is saying that is not true. In fact, the actualization of the promise to return to Israel can occur through human agency, through human hands. And Rabbi Alkali also was a Kabbalist, a mystic, and he had an understanding of sort of different eras in Jewish history, and he believed that this sort of next era was actually in 1840, that was going to be a big year for return to Israel, and that it wasn't automatic, but if the Jewish people were motivated, then the time would have been ripe for that to happen. I believe he had another understanding that if that didn't happen, it would take another 100 years until 1940, when that window would reopen, but also an understanding that that would be through much harsher measures. So in that way, also very prescient, because we all know what happens in 1939 and 1940. But the fundamental idea that we see here from these two real proto-Zionists they are traditional Orthodox rabbis, and they believe from a messianic perspective that we should be returning to the land of Israel, and that human beings should take agency in making that happen. Now, they weren't the only Orthodox rabbis who we could sort of describe as being Zionist. Slightly later than them, Yitzchak Yaakov Reines was a rabbi who also became the head of Mizrahi. And he too was, I guess, what you could actually really call at this point, not just proto-Zionist, but religious Zionist rabbi. Mizrahi continues on to be a religious Zionist organization. But for him, excuse me, it's very much not a messianic Zionism. And he writes that Zionist ideology is devoid of any trace of the idea of redemption. In none of the Zionist acts or aspirations is there the slightest allusion to future redemption. Their sole intention is to improve Israel's situation, to raise their stature and accustom them to a life of happiness. How can one compare this with the idea of redemption? So this now actually becomes very interesting, because we have a few different ways that we might understand theologically what's happening with Zionism. On the one hand, we can view this as the anti-Zionists did, which is to say that we're violating these oaths. We're violating this notion that redemption will come from a messianic era. On the other hand, we have the people who are messianists, but they're saying that messianism can come about through human agency. And here, from Rabbi Reines, we're almost saying that I don't think he really is saying this exactly, but almost as if the secular nature of modern political Zionism is an asset here, because we can say this isn't the redemption. This is a political movement, just as Jews for history would have had thoughts and ideas about, let's say, socialism or communism. There's Israel, and it's an opportunity for Jews to return to Israel in a way that will provide them with safety, and that's the fundamental tenets of Zionism, because it's really secular. So he is definitely not a messianist, but is also saying he's in certain ways actually reducing the significance, the religious significance of Zionism, and as a result, therefore, it's not actually problematic, because it's not really encroaching upon or improperly trying to take a more messianic approach. Now, this notion of separating between Zionism and sort of religious redemption is also seen in the thought of Yeshayahu Leibovich, who, if you've come to my classes before, is always a fun thinker to kind of have on a source sheet, because he always has somewhat radical views. He was a brilliant, I think he was a physician and a chemist, and he had another PhD and a major scholar. who for many years had a radio show in Israel. And he writes the following. He says, "I wish to introduce myself at the outset as one who hasn't been at all disappointed by the state of Israel. For me, the state of Israel has fulfilled all the hopes I had for it ever since my early youth back in Europe. For ever since I became a Zionist, Zionism meant for me the endeavor to liberate Jews from being ruled by Gentiles. The state of Israel completely satisfies the demand for freedom from domination. The state of Israel of our day has no religious significance." Right? So he's a Zionist and he's religious, but he's saying those two things are distinct from one another. "The genuine religious problem is not the problem of the state, but rather of the Jewish people, which for the last 2,000 years or so, generation after generation, has progressively been losing its essential attributes. This process was not halted or even retarded by the establishment of the state. Regarding the state as an intrinsic value is the essence of fascism." Right? So he basically says, we as Jews are political, and whether that politics takes place in a purely diasporic way, where, if you live in America, you're politically active in your local politics or your national politics, whatever that be, and that's distinct and separate from your religious life, almost a real difference between or separation between religion and state. Leibovitz is saying basically the same thing. And he's saying that the state of Israel as a political entity, for him, has actually been a remarkable success. Jews are far safer in Israel than they were in Europe, and he's less concerned as pertains to Zionism with perhaps broader questions of redemption and things of that nature, because that's not even on the table for him. And then separately, he has his religious concerns, which would be the same religious concerns almost if you're in the diaspora or if you're in the land of Israel. So now I want to turn to perhaps the most significant thinker we're going to see today, Rav Kook. So Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook eventually became the first chief rabbi of then Palestine. He dies before the state in 1935. And he sort of made Aliyah, I think, in the early 20th century, lived in Yaffo for a while, and then had to leave and got stuck during World War I outside, was in England and a pulpit rabbi there for a while, and then returned to Israel, where he opened an important yeshiva and became the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi. And Rav Kook is, I would say, a truly sui generis thinker. He is someone who was both brilliant, and he was understood to be brilliant when he was already a student in Volozhin. So in terms of just his intellectual acumen, he was sort of the highest caliber, although we have many stories of rabbis who are Elohim, who are really geniuses in that way. But he also had this incredible mystical sensibility. And so his writings are actually very difficult to parse sometimes, because he's almost writing in prophetic kind of language. And Rav Kook was important for a number of reasons, and we're going to see some of his thinking here in a moment. But one of the major pieces to Rav Kook was he viewed the secular Zionists as being motivated almost subconsciously in a deep way by religious motivation. So he kind of saw the hand of God in all of modern political Zionism, which allowed him to view what for many Orthodox was anathema to them, this highly secular worldview. It allowed him to view them in a positive light. One could be critical and say there's also a paternalism there, that he's telling people that they don't even understand what they're doing, but he understands them more than they do. Nevertheless, it really made him a unique thinker. But he was, for sure, because of his views, also kind of cast out of the Orthodox establishment. I will say that when he died in 1935, I forget the exact number, but it was some extraordinary number of people attended his funeral, in part because he built all of these relationships, not just with fellow religious Zionists, but with so many secular Jews also, and secular institutions like the Hebrew University, Bezalel, the art school. So let's take a look at some of the key, and there's a lot of writing for Rav Kook, but some of the key things that he says on this topic. So the first, which is going to take us a bit back to what we saw before from Wishgrad at the very beginning, he writes that Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, is not something apart from the soul of Jewish people. It is no mere national possession, right? Think about what Leibovich was just saying and how different this is. Serving as a means of unifying our people and buttressing its material or even its spiritual survival. Eretz Yisrael is part of the very essence of our nationhood. It is bound organically to its very life and inner being. And if you think back to what Wishegard was saying, right, and that promise that Abraham is given this land, there's a way in which from the very moment that that Abraham is elected, is chosen, right, it comes along with this land itself. And there's a way in which that is very holistic, that we can't just think of religious life as being a life of the spirit. It's a life of the family, which is flesh and blood, and it's a life of the material of the land itself. And those two things cannot be extricated from each other. And so for Rav Kook, the sort of whole life in exile is an unnatural way of being religiously. It's a way in which it's almost like the body and the soul, or the material and the spirit, are two separate from each other. And when we return to the physical land of Israel, that is not just Jewish people, but Judaism being able to live in its truly natural and organic state. Rav Kook says very powerfully also this idea. He says that the state truly is the higher rung on the ladder of fulfillment, and this is our state, the state of Israel. I've been told this is the first time that anyone used the term Medina Yisrael, the foundations of God's throne in the world, whose entire desire is that God be one and his name one, which is truly is the highest bliss. So we see here that for Rav Kook, this certainly is a messianic aspiration. It's the Jews ultimately returning to Israel to fulfill their ultimate destiny. And he also believes that once that happens, that then has reverberations for all of humanity. Rav Kook was very much, focused on both the Jewish people and his own sense of how they are unique, but also humanitarian in viewing that the Jews' role is ultimately for the betterment of all of humanity. Now, I want to raise one other idea before we head towards closing, from both Rav Kook and from Rav Reines, which is the question of what is this state going to look like, and how do we think of force and the military within this state? And both Reines and Rav Kook say things which I think are fairly surprising. So Rav Reines writes, "A force from without compelled us to forsake the political arena of the world. But our withdrawal was also motivated in an inward ascent, as if to say that we are awaiting the advent of a happier time when government, this is Rav Kook, when government could be conducted without ruthlessness and barbarism. That is the day for which we hope." So what Kook here is saying is that the exile that took place 2,000 years ago meant that basically Jews were plucked from history. We lost political agency. But there's a way in which there's a value to that, because politics, as they had been existing, were filled with ruthlessness and barbarism. And that gave us an opportunity to be separate from that. And he continues on. He says, "The day has come, it is very near, when the world will grow gentler. We can begin to prepare ourselves, for it will soon be possible for us to conduct a state of our own, founded on goodness, wisdom, justice, and the clear light of God." He continues, "It is not meant for Jacob to engage in political life at a time when statehood requires bloody ruthlessness and demands a talent for evil." So Rav Kook dies in 1935. He certainly lived through World War I, but his overall, I think, theology was one that we are evolving in a positive way. I think you saw the time between the end of World War I and his own death as one where we were finally moving past this stage of where human beings would fight with each other and heading towards a completely different paradigm for how the world would be. And in his mind, the Jewish people were very fit for that moment because we had been protected from political life, didn't have to think of things, all kinds of political life, but specifically, I think, military force. And as a result, once the world, in his terms, softened, then that would be a time would be ripe for Jews to assume, re-enter politics at a time when the rules of the game would be much gentler. Of course, he died shortly before the Holocaust, and very hard to sort of read his words when we know what happened just a few years later. But I do think it's something which is important to share, and there's a lot of curiosity as to how Rav Kook would have understood both the Holocaust and then the state of Israel as it emerged, and of course the necessity for having an army and military. Rabbi Reines says something very similar, and he creates this dialectic between the sword and the book. And he says the sword and the book are opposed to one another, and the domination of one is entwined with that of the other. The domination of the sword will last, while the book has not spread its authority over the world. But when the book will spread over the world, there will be no remembrance of the sword. As it says in the Tractate of Sanhedrin, one should not enter the Beit Midrash, the study hall, armed. Because arms and the Beit Midrash are opposites, arms are the sign of the destruction of the world, and the Beit Midrash is the sign of the completion of the person and their development. The Beit Midrash is a place where they publicize and promote Torah. The goal is to erase foolishness from the world and to raise up faith, I guess, to its purity, and to remove bitterness and the spirit of murder and the shedding of blood from the world, and to bring people to their completeness. And so again, here we have this sense of this dichotomy between this other form of existence that doesn't have to concern itself with a military and force, and a world which is in fact governed by that kind of by the necessity for a military. So neither of these two people had a chance to live into the founding of the state of Israel, and I do think that that actually becomes a much its own kind of conversation. And we talked a little bit about this, and I think I gave a class on some element of military ethics. I'll go back and look. If not, I'm happy to give that here. But a whole other set of questions then emerge after the founding of the state of Israel, many which we're sadly dealing with today, which is how do you conduct an army with proper sort of Jewish values, and not just an army in general, but also one which is fighting against or the civilian casualties that are a necessity, redeeming hostages that I've certainly taught about before. These are deeply fraught questions, and in many ways, the Jewish tradition doesn't have a lot of wisdom that directly applies and has to be extrapolated from much more subtle values. But for Rav Kook and for Rav Reines, I think there was a sense and a thinking, at least a hope, that we would never have to be confronted with these questions, that the world would change in such a way that Jews would be able to live in a world where there was political leadership and agency, but not having to make decisions dealing with using force, using violence, because in their mind, that's sort of the world that had existed, and that's for the non-Jews. But for the Jews, we've cultivated a set of values in the diaspora that we're more ripe to address concerns that don't have to do with that kind of violence. And that's where the emergence of the state of Israel in the last 76 years present some really significant challenges for religious thinking. And there's been a whole lot of literature which has been written, which in many ways I think is actually some of the most exciting, not in sort of a happy way, but exciting of what's come out of the state of Israel, that it's required this kind of innovative thinking because there isn't so much precedent for it. We don't have a lot of time, so I just want to share one maybe final text from one of my teachers, Rabbi Yehuda Amital. Rav Amital was the founder of Yeshivat Har Zion, really the first leader of the Hesder movement, which combined religious study and army service. And he also briefly served in the Israeli Knesset after Yitzhak Rabin was assassinated. And really a fascinating thinker. He himself was also a Holocaust survivor. And he says something which I think is very beautiful, where we try and think of these questions of, whether from a messianic perspective of how do we think of Zionism? What should exactly the state look like? How does this relate to the ancient prophecies of return? And I guess also, if you look at some of the Hasidic or Orthodox opposition to Zionism, that there's a sense that there will be this miraculous return where the world will be completely reshaped. But for Rav Amital, he focuses on a much more quaint prophecy, and he writes the following. He says, "The prophet says, old men and old women shall yet again sit in the streets of Jerusalem. Once again, there will be boys and girls playing in the streets. Simple, normal life. Only someone with a deep historical awareness can understand the significance of such a scene. Miracles are one-time events. But Jews living a normal life in Eretz Yisrael after 70 years of Babylonian exile, during which the country was empty and desolate, that's when that prophecy comes from. Someone looking with historical perspective can only be astonished. For us, every natural phenomenon becomes a supernatural one. For us, nothing is simple. After 2,000 years, children play in the streets of Israel, in the squares of Jerusalem. And this is harder, I think, to read this year because daily life in Israel, I think, has returned in many ways to normal, but there's a shadow which is constantly being cast of men and women who are off to war. And nevertheless, I think even amidst all the challenges and the quagmires of political decisions and military decisions and moral questions, if you were to walk in Jerusalem today, you would still see old men and old women sitting there, and young boys and young girls playing in the streets. And I think, when I think of Yom Ha'atzmaut, which we just had yesterday, of something to celebrate, is even in the midst of some of those really big challenges that we currently have, to not lose sight of also the incredible moment that we live in where this gets to be true. And it's not something tremendous. It's simple, but even in that simplicity, there's still something which is really remarkably profound. And I think that's a message for all of us, both as we think about Israel, but also in our own lives, a constant reminder that even some of the simple things in life are things that we should have profound gratitude for. So I'm going to pause here and stop the recording. If anyone wants to ask any questions or wants to comment, now's a good time. And you should be able to unmute yourself also.
I think you're still recording, at least that my screen is flashing.